He lay beneath the ancient oak, perfectly still. To anyone passing by, he looked like a man lost in a deep, dreamless sleep. But Alessandro Moretti wasn't asleep. He was hiding. At 38 years old, the head of the most powerful crime family in the city had learned that the only way to escape the endless meetings, the blood-soaked contracts, the hollow echo of power, was to pretend the world didn't exist. So he closed his eyes, let the afternoon light filter through the broad branches above him, and for just a few precious minutes, he was no one at all. But fate has a way of shattering silence. On the other side of the garden, a 3-year-old girl in a pink dress chased a butterfly. Her name was Emma, and she had no idea who the man beneath the tree was. All she saw was a warm, gentle place to rest. She toddled over, curled up on his chest like he was the softest pillow in the world, and smiled. In that single innocent moment, 3 lives collided. A wounded king, a desperate mother, and a child who saw only kindness. What happened next would change everything. Before we begin the story, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe. Your support means more than you know. Now let's step back. Let's go back to the beginning. Hours before Emma's tiny hand ever rested over his heart, Alessandro Moretti woke alone in a bedroom the size of most people's entire apartments. He stared up at a ceiling of dark walnut beams that had watched over 3 generations of his family. Sunlight bled through curtains thick enough to stop a bullet. He didn't move for a long time. He just lay there, one arm behind his head, listening to the silence of a house that never really slept. The Moretti estate wasn't a home. It was a fortress dressed like one. 40 armed men rotated through 3 shifts around the perimeter. 3 layers of cameras watched every corridor, every window, every inch of wall. And beneath the wine cellar, a reinforced bunker waited for the day someone finally succeeded in reaching him. His father had built it during the War of '89. His father had also died before he ever needed to use it. Alessandro sat up slowly, swung his feet onto the cold marble floor. On the nightstand sat a small silver pocket watch, its case worn smooth by decades of his father's thumb. He picked it up, felt the familiar weight settle into his palm. Engraved on the inside rim in tiny, elegant script were 3 words in an old language. In sanguine veritas. In blood, truth. He clicked it open. The soft ticking filled the room. To most men, it would have sounded like a heartbeat. To Alessandro that morning, it sounded like a countdown. Marco Biensi stepped inside without knocking. He was the only man in the world allowed to do that. 35 years old, broad-shouldered, moving with the economy of a soldier who'd been shot twice and stabbed once. Every time protecting the man sitting in front of him. Marco had been at Alessandro's side through the war with the Costa family, the collapse of the Northern Alliance, and the long bloody months after Naples. Marco was more than loyal. He was the last person on earth who remembered who Alessandro had been before any of it. "Good morning, boss. Carlo is waiting downstairs." Alessandro nodded, slipped the watch into the inner pocket of his coat, right over his heart. Down in the study, Carlo Rizzi stood beside the long mahogany desk, a leather folder open in his weathered hands. 55 years old, silver-haired, perfectly dressed. He had served the Moretti family for 15 years and had never once been late. His voice was smooth as poured wine as he read the schedule aloud. 3 meetings before noon. 1 with the dockworkers' union. 1 with the accountants. 1 with a judge whose son had made a very expensive mistake. A drive to the harbor at 4 to inspect a shipment. And at 9 that evening, a quiet visit to a restaurant owner in the East District who had fallen 4 months behind on his payments. Alessandro listened without expression. Behind his eyes, something tightened. He said only 1 word. "Fine." Carlo bowed slightly and withdrew. Marco lingered, sensing what always came next on mornings like this. Alessandro walked to the window and looked out at the far edge of the garden, where the ancient oak lifted its wide branches into the still afternoon light. He would go there today. He would disappear, if only for an hour. He reached for his coat and slid his arms through the sleeves. 2 floors below, in the small back kitchen, A young woman pressed a trembling finger to her lips and whispered to a 3-year-old girl in a pink dress. Asterisk, please. Please stay hidden. Asterisk. Sophia Rossi crouched beside a cabinet, her hands shaking as she smoothed the wrinkles from her daughter's dress. Her breath came shallow and fast. She had been in this house for exactly 22 days. And she had spent every single one of them praying she wouldn't lose the job. 3 weeks. That was all it had been since a woman from the employment agency had called with a strange offer. A live-in housekeeping position at a private estate on the outskirts of the city. For times her last salary. Meals included. No experience required beyond the ability to keep her mouth shut and her eyes forward. The employer, the agent had said carefully, was a discreet businessman in imports and exports. Nothing more. Nothing less. Sophia had known the moment she stepped through the wrought iron gates that it was a lie dressed in expensive clothes. But she needed the money too badly to turn back. 6 months earlier, on a rainy October night, she had run from a city 300 miles east. Nothing but her daughter in her arms and $300 folded inside a cheap plastic wallet. Her ex-husband Daniel had been a gambler, then a drinker, then a man who raised his hand to his wife when the losses grew too heavy to carry. She had endured that. What she would never endure was the night he raised the same hand to their 6-month-old daughter because the baby wouldn't stop crying. Sophia waited until he passed out on the couch. She packed one bag. She walked out into the rain. And she never looked back. Now here she was, in a mansion where the staff moved in a strange, watchful silence, where the other housekeepers never spoke of the men in dark suits who came and went through the side entrance, where one night 2 weeks ago she had heard something that might have been gunfire echoing from somewhere below the wine cellar, and learned, by the frozen look on the head chef's face the next morning, that she was never to ask about it. She had understood then what kind of house she was cleaning. She had swallowed it down because 4 times her old salary meant she could rent a small apartment across the river next month. It meant Emma could have new shoes. It meant her daughter would never grow up in the shadow of a man who drank. She had understood everything, except that at 7:15 that morning, the sitter had called to cancel. A fever. A husband away. 1,000 apologies. Sophia had made 8 desperate calls in 20 minutes. No one answered. No one was available. And she could not miss a day. So she had done the only thing left. She bundled Emma into a coat, walked her through the servants' entrance, and hid her in the small back kitchen where deliveries were sorted and no member of the family ever set foot. Baby, listen to me. Sophia crouched until her eyes were level with her daughter's. You sit right here. You do not move. You do not make a sound. Mama will be back very soon. Emma nodded solemnly, her honey-colored eyes wide. Rosa, the head cook, appeared behind her with a small plate of buttered bread. Her face was pale. She pressed the plate into Emma's tiny hands, then leaned close to Sophia's ear. Her voice was barely a whisper. Asterisk, do not let anyone see her. Not one soul. Especially not the boss. Asterisk. Sophia nodded. She gathered her cleaning cart. And she hurried out. Sophia disappeared up the back stairs with a wicker basket of linens wedged against her hip. Behind her, in the quiet kitchen, Emma chewed her bread slowly and turned her small face toward the window. A tiny orange butterfly had just drifted past the glass. Then the back kitchen fell silent again. Emma chewed the last corner of her buttered bread and watched the little butterfly hover just outside the window pane. Its wings opened and closed like a slow, secret door. She counted to 30 in her head. Then she counted to 30 again because Mama had said, do not move. And Mama's voice that morning had been tight and tired, the way it got when something was wrong. But the butterfly didn't fly away. It seemed to be waiting for her. It seemed, in fact, to be looking right at her through the glass. Emma slid off the wooden stool and padded across the tile floor on her small bare feet. The side door was heavy, but the latch was low. She lifted it with both hands, and the morning air rushed in, warm and sweet, smelling of cut grass. Her pink dress, embroidered along the hem with tiny white daisies, fluttered around her knees as she stepped into a world she had never been allowed to see. The garden stretched on and on. pale gravel paths lined with rose bushes taller than she was. A great stone fountain sat in the center of the lawn, its water catching the sunlight and turning it into 1,000 small, shining coins. And above it all, above everything, was a sky so blue and so wide it made her small chest feel funny inside, like her heart had grown too big for it. The butterfly danced over the roses. Emma ran after it. It swooped past the fountain, and she chased it with breathless little laughs, her bare feet slapping softly on the warm stones. It flew across a stretch of open lawn, and she followed, dress flying, curls bouncing. Then, at the far edge of the garden, the butterfly rose up and vanished into the leaves of the largest tree Emma Rossi had ever seen in all her 3 years of life.
She stopped.
She pressed one small hand to her chest and tried to catch her breath. The tree was enormous. Its trunk was so wide, she was certain even 4 grown-ups holding hands couldn't reach around it. Its branches spread out like the arms of a great, kind giant, and its leaves whispered together in a language she almost understood. Broad pools of cool shade lay across the grass beneath it. It didn't look scary at all. It looked like the kind of tree that told stories to itself when no one was listening. Then Emma saw something that made her tilt her head the way small children do when the world hands them a puzzle. A man was lying underneath it. He was lying very still, his hands folded across his chest, his eyes closed. His long dark coat had fallen open, and beneath the collar of a crisp white shirt, she could see a thin silver chain catching the light. His face was not the face of a scary man. It was the face of a tired one. She stepped closer through the soft grass. Something inside her, something she was too small to name, told her this man was lost, just like she had been, chasing a butterfly. She climbed up carefully, curled herself into a small, warm shape on his chest, and rested her tiny hand right over the slow, steady beating of his heart. Beneath her palm, 2 closed gray eyes prepared themselves to open. His first reaction was not thought. It was instinct. The instant a foreign weight pressed against his chest, Alejandro Moretti's right hand slid inside his open coat and closed around the grip of the Beretta holstered beneath his left ribs. For 20 years, no living soul had been permitted within arm's reach while his eyes were closed. Not a servant, not a soldier, not even Marco. The men who had tried, on 3 separate occasions across 2 decades, were no longer counted among the living. His finger found the trigger guard. His shoulders coiled. His gray eyes snapped open. And the world stopped. He was looking up into a small, round face framed by soft brown curls. Honey-colored eyes. A little pink dress with tiny white daisies embroidered along the hem. A hand no larger than a plum resting flat against the center of his chest. So light he could barely feel it. So trusting that for a full second, his mind refused to process what it was seeing. A child. Every trained muscle in his body froze exactly where it was. His hand was still on the pistol. His breath had stopped in his throat. 20 years of survival instinct collided all at once with a truth so small it shouldn't have been able to overturn anything. And yet everything inside him tilted. The little girl smiled at him. A slow, unhurried, entirely fearless smile. "Hi, Uncle." She said it the way a child says something obvious. The way she might have greeted a bird on a windowsill, or the moon through a bedroom window. As if finding a strange man asleep beneath a tree and climbing onto his chest were the most ordinary thing a Tuesday morning could possibly contain. Alejandro did not answer for a very long moment. He, who had ordered the deaths of 12 men without so much as a change in expression, who had negotiated 3 ceasefires in rooms full of loaded rifles, who had spoken at his own father's funeral without a single crack in his voice, could not find a single word to say to a 3-year-old. His hand slid slowly, slowly away from the Beretta. "Hello," he finally answered, and the sound came out lower and rougher than he intended, like a voice pulled from a place inside him he had forgotten how to visit.
Emma seemed satisfied by this.
She turned her attention to the thin silver chain resting against a shirt. She took hold of it with both careful hands and began to draw it upward. The small silver pocket watch slid out of the inner pocket of his coat and dangled between them, catching the sun in flashes of light. She lifted it to her ear. Tick-tock, she whispered. Wide-eyed uncle, your clock is singing. Something inside Alejandro Moretti cracked. It did not hurt. That was what surprised him most. There are moments in a man's life when the entire weight of what he has become is dismantled by something that weighs no more than a bird. And this, he understood without understanding, was one of them. 20 years of iron and silence gave way, not to a blow, but to a sound. To one small, delighted voice pressing his father's watch against her ear and telling him it was singing. He did not push her away. He did not move at all. He lay in the grass beneath his father's tree and let the ticking of a dead man's watch fold itself gently around the breathing of a child he had never met. Somewhere across the lawn, a woman's frantic footsteps came pounding through the grass. Sophia had searched for 10 minutes. 10 minutes that felt like a lifetime, and looked from the outside like a young woman moving very calmly and very quickly through the corridors of a house she had no right to be running in. The back kitchen, the pantry, the delivery corridor, the lower laundry, the narrow servant staircase. Each empty room stole a little more air from her lungs. She kept her voice down because she could not call out her daughter's name in this house. If a guard heard, if the boss heard. She reached the kitchen for the second time, and Rosa was standing in the doorway with a rag pressed against her mouth. The head cook's face had gone the color of old milk. She went outside, Rosa whispered. The side door. I only turned my back for a moment. Sophia did not answer. She was already running. Her cleaning apron flapped against her thighs as she burst through the side door and into the sunlight. The garden was too big. The paths went in too many directions. She turned in a full circle once, twice. And then she heard nothing. Nothing at all. And it was that silence that terrified her most. It wasn't the shouting. It wasn't the threats. It was something else. Something quieter. Something that, more than any scream, finally broke her. She ran, not thinking, just moving. Pure animal instinct carrying her across the vast stretch of lawn. She followed the thin trail of crushed grass her daughter's bare feet had left behind. Past the roses.
Past the fountain.
Around the tall hedge. And then she saw them. Her 3-year-old girl curled up like a tiny, trusting creature on the chest of Don Alessandro Moretti. His long dark coat had fallen open around her small body. His silver pocket watch dangled loosely from her tiny fist. His gray eyes were open, fixed on something Sophia couldn't name. She saw the top of Emma's curly head, and her knees gave out. She dropped onto the grass with a soft, broken sound, her forehead almost touching the ground. The words spilled out of her like water through a crack in a dam. Shaking. Unbroken. The kind of speech that comes from someone who's already accepted they might not live long enough to finish the sentence.
Sir, please.
Please don't hurt her. She's only a baby. She doesn't know. I'm her mother. This is my fault. I brought her here. I hid her. The sitter canceled. I had no one.
Please.
I'll go. I'll leave the city tonight. I'll never speak a word about this house to anyone for as long as I live. Just please. Please don't touch my child. Alessandro sat up slowly. One strong arm cradled beneath Emma's small back so she wouldn't slide. He looked at the woman on the grass in front of him. He saw a young mother, no older than 27, dressed in the plain gray uniform of his own household. He saw hands that shook. He saw a spine bent double before a man who could, with a single word, erase her. He recognized the shape of that fear. He had planted it himself, in one form or another, across half the rooms of the city. And for the first time in more years than he could count, he felt something very close to shame. Stand up, he said quietly. You don't need to kneel. Sophia lifted her tear-streaked face. She raised both trembling hands toward him.
Please.
Give her back to me. Alessandro glanced down at the small weight against his chest. Somewhere in the last minute, Emma's breathing had slowed. Her cheek had settled fully against his shirt. She had, at some point, actually fallen asleep. She's sleeping, he murmured. Don't wake her. Sophia stood frozen on the grass, unable to understand what was happening. Alessandro rose to his feet slowly, careful not to disturb her. He shifted his weight until Emma settled naturally against his shoulder, her curly head tucked into the crook of his neck, one small fist still curled loosely around the silver chain of his pocket watch. He held her the way a man holds something he's forgotten how to be trusted with. Sophia watched him do it, and felt her breath stop somewhere between her ribs.
Follow me, he said.
It wasn't an order. It was almost gentle. He walked back across the lawn toward the mansion, and Sophia trailed a step behind him like a shadow that had lost the shape it was cast from. Her uniform was damp with dew from the grass. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every guard they passed on the gravel path turned his eyes carefully to the ground, as if the sight of the boss carrying a sleeping child was something no one was supposed to have witnessed. At the great oak doors of the main entrance, Marco Bianchi was already waiting. He'd been watching from the terrace. His broad face didn't move a single muscle when he took in the scene, but Sophia caught the flicker in his eyes. "Marco," Alessandro said in a low voice, still cradling the sleeping child. "The empty suite at the far end of the east wing. My old playroom. Have it opened, aired, and made ready by tomorrow morning.
Books. Toys.
A soft chair for the mother. Warm rugs. Anything a small child would need. 24 hours. Marco's mouth opened, then closed. He gave a single disciplined nod. "Yes, Don Alessandro." Carlo Ricci was standing just inside the shadow of the corridor. Sophia hadn't noticed him until this moment. The old butler's silver hair was combed back with its usual precision. His face was composed into a mask of practiced deference. But his eyes, when they moved from the sleeping child to Alessandro, were the color and temperature of polished marble. He cleared his throat softly. "Don Alessandro, if I may, the security of this estate depends on strict control of who resides within its walls. A child, especially one belonging to newer staff, could easily become a—" "I did not ask for your counsel, Carlo." The words were quiet. They cut cleanly. Carlo lowered his head a precise half-inch and stepped back into the shadow. Sophia found her voice at last, thin and pleading.
"Sir."
"I cannot accept this. I'm only a housekeeper. My daughter should not be." Alessandro turned his gray eyes on her. They were tired, but they were not cold. "You are the mother of a child, Sophia. That is the most important work being done in this house." He passed the sleeping little girl carefully into her arms. Emma stirred without waking, nuzzled into her mother's shoulder, and let out a soft breath that smelled faintly of buttered bread. That night, in the narrow servants' room where mother and daughter had been given two cots pushed together, Sophia lay on her back and stared at the dark ceiling. She didn't close her eyes for a single hour. Beside her, Emma clutched the same worn stuffed rabbit she had carried out of a rainy city 300 miles away 6 months ago. Just before she drifted off, she blinked sleepily at her mother. "Mama," she whispered, "is the kind uncle our new friend now?" Sophia opened her mouth. She closed it. She smoothed her daughter's curls with a trembling hand and did not know what to answer. Outside her small window, the mansion breathed for the first time in 20 years. 3 weeks passed, then 4. The playroom at the end of the east wing bloomed almost overnight, exactly as Marco had promised. Fresh curtains of pale yellow hung across tall windows that had been sealed shut for 2 decades. A round rug, the color of morning cream, covered the old parquet floor. Shelves that had once held a boy's leather-bound storybooks now held a jumble of picture books, wooden blocks, and a small basket of stuffed animals. In the corner sat a soft armchair, large enough for a mother to nap in while her daughter played at her feet. Emma took possession of the room the way small children take possession of everything given to them, which is to say, completely and without ceremony. Her laughter began to echo down corridors that had, for as long as anyone in the household could remember, carried only the sound of low commands, the ringing of dress shoes on marble, and the occasional click of a magazine being loaded. Now the laughter of a 3-year-old drifted through the great gallery in the afternoons, past the oil portraits of dead Moretti patriarchs, and out toward the terrace, like something the house itself had been holding in for far too long. Marco Bianchi didn't know what to make of it at first. He stood at the top of the east staircase one afternoon and listened to that little voice singing to itself in the playroom below. Something in his hard, tired face softened without his permission. He had not seen his boss walk with lighter shoulders since Don Salvatore had been alive. He was old enough and loyal enough to admit to himself, in private, that this was good. He was also professional enough to know it was dangerous. Quietly, without a word to anyone, Marco doubled the perimeter patrols. He added 2 riflemen to the north wall. He rerouted the guard rotation so the east wing always had eyes on it. The boss wouldn't thank him for this. The boss wouldn't need to. The other men whispered in the barracks, in the kitchens, over cigarettes on the back terrace. The dawn was going soft. He was letting a woman and a child sleep under his roof. He was smiling. Alessandro Moretti did not smile. Sofia, for her part, was learning the shape of the world she had walked into. She heard things. The first thing she noticed were the whispers. Whenever she walked through a room, the men would fall silent mid-sentence. It was subtle at first, but with each passing day, Sofia understood more clearly exactly what kind of business kept the lights burning in that mansion. And yet, when she stood in the doorway and watched her employer by the window, hands in his pockets, eyes lost somewhere far beyond the glass, she did not see a monster. She saw a man in chains forged long before he was old enough to refuse them. Alessandro started inventing reasons to walk past the east wing. A plumbing valve that needed checking. A window latch that stuck. A cracked tile that only he had noticed. Marco pretended not to see through it. Sofia pretended not to see through it. Then came one golden afternoon when Emma pulled him down onto the cream-colored rug and taught him, with a serious authority that only a 3-year-old can command, how to stack a proper tower of wooden blocks. When it collapsed for the 5th time, she shrieked with delighted laughter and clapped her small hands together. And without warning, Alessandro remembered. He was 4 years old, sitting beneath the ancient oak in the back garden, stacking wooden blocks with a great, patient man who smelled of cigars and cedar. His father. 30 years ago. A memory he had buried so deeply he had almost convinced himself it had never happened. He sat on the rug and laughed. The sound of it was rusted. Unfamiliar. But it came out of him anyway. In the doorway, Sofia stood very still and watched. And her heart began to beat quickly for a reason she was not yet willing to name. But not everyone inside the compound was pleased by what was blooming in the east wing. Carlo Ricci stood in the doorway of Alessandro's study on a gray Thursday morning, waiting to be acknowledged with the perfect stillness of a man who had waited on Moretti men for 15 years. He had entered this room every morning since Salvatore Moretti had died in his chair by the fireplace of a heart attack, 12 years ago last November. He had brought young Alessandro his coffee on the morning after the funeral, and every morning since. He had arranged household budgets, hired staff, dismissed staff, walked the perimeter with the head of security every dawn. And 3 weeks ago, he had quietly instructed a certain employment agency to send a very particular young mother to a very particular vacant housekeeping post at the Moretti estate. No one had noticed. No one ever did. Don Alessandro, he began softly. His voice carried the careful concern of an old family retainer who had earned the right to speak honestly, at least a little. Forgive my impertinence, but the woman and her daughter in the east wing, they are a weight. This house is not built to carry it. Alessandro did not look up from the ledger open on his desk. Go on. Enemies of this family will hear of them within the month. Perhaps sooner. When they do, that woman and that child become the shortest path anyone will ever have to your heart. He paused. For their own safety and for the peace of the estate, they should be relocated discreetly. Generously. A furnished apartment across the river. A living stipend for 2 years. I can arrange it by Friday. No one need ever know they were here. Alessandro closed the ledger. He looked up at last, and his gray eyes settled on the old butler the way a hand settles on the grip of a weapon. The silence stretched. Carlo did not move.
No.
One word. Quiet. And final. Carlo lowered his silver head a precise half-inch. As you wish, Don Alessandro. He withdrew from the room, without another sound. Marco Bianchi came in 3 minutes later. He closed the door behind him and did not bother with pleasantries. He crossed to the desk, opened a folder, and laid 3 photographs across the leather blotter. A warehouse in the South District. Hit at 3 in the morning last night. 2 of our men dead. The crew got in through the delivery gate, which was supposed to be reinforced last month. Someone knew it wasn't. He tapped the second photograph. A shipment of cigarettes came off a container ship at Pier 9 on Tuesday. It never reached the warehouse. It never even reached the truck. Someone knew the exact half hour it would sit exposed. He tapped the third photograph, and his jaw tightened. Antonio Ricci, Carlo's younger brother, shot at a cafe in the Old Quarter yesterday at 4 in the afternoon. 2 men, silenced pistols. The cafe owner did not see their faces. Alessandro studied the third photograph for a long time. Antonio Ricci had been one of the lower capos running collections on the east side. Competent, but never important. Marco. Yes, Don Alessandro. How many people in this family knew the reinforcement schedule for the South Warehouse? 4. How many knew the arrival window at Pier 9? 4. How many knew where Antonio drank his coffee every afternoon? Marco's voice was very quiet. 4. Alessandro did not speak for a long moment. He lifted his silver pocket watch from the desk and let it dangle from its chain, listening to it tick. There's a leak inside this family. Yes, boss. Alessandro's eyes moved slowly to the closed study door, through which Carlo had just walked 10 minutes before. He did not name a suspect. Not to Marco. Not even yet to himself. But in that instant, in the quiet of the study, he began in absolute silence to hunt. The hunt Alessandro had begun in silence did not change his outward routine by a single degree. He rose at the same hour. He drank the same black coffee. He walked the same halls. But underneath, a new set of rules was being written into the architecture of the estate. And only Marco knew about them. Chief among them was a rule so quiet that no one who lived by it was ever told it aloud. Not one act of violence. Not one family council. Not one interrogation would ever take place within 100 meters of the East Wing. Not while a small girl in a pink dress was still awake in it. Marco moved the 2 soundproofed meeting rooms down into the lower west corridor. The men who came to see the Don on unpleasant business were now escorted through the servants' entrance and out the same way. If a cigarette smoker on the terrace happened to overhear something, Marco moved the terrace smokers to the north garage. The East Wing became, in every practical sense, an island inside the fortress. Sophia noticed all of it. She was not a naive woman. A woman who had walked out of a rainy city with $300 in her wallet did not stay naive for long. She saw the way the guards routed themselves around Emma's playroom now. She saw the softness in Marco's shoulders when he came out of that end of the house, and the hardness that returned the instant he crossed back toward the study. One autumn evening, after Emma had chased fireflies across the lawn until she fell asleep against Alessandro's shoulder beneath the ancient oak, Sophia sat on the stone bench beside him and asked the question she had been carrying inside her for weeks. Alessandro, are you a bad man? He did not lie to her. He told her about Salvador, who had built this family from nothing after the war. From small crimes into large ones. Through open confrontations with 5 rival houses that had left 3 of them extinct. He told her about the morning 12 years ago when he had walked into his father's study and found the old man slumped in his chair with a cold cup of coffee in his hand. And how he had inherited a throne at 26 that he had never once been asked whether he wanted. He told her about Elena Vasquez. 5 years ago.
His bride.
3 months from the wedding. Beautiful and quiet and, as it turned out, thoroughly bought. She had accepted a townhouse on the coast and a suitcase of cash from the Sabatini family in exchange for the reservation number of a small trattoria in Naples, where Alessandro would be dining without his usual detail. 3 men had come through the kitchen door. One had reached him. He unbuttoned the top of his shirt without ceremony and showed her the puckered scar beneath his left collarbone. 1.5 inches below the artery that would have ended everything. Sophia lifted her hand and placed it over the scar. His fingertips brushed gently against the old wound. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She didn't run. She only spoke, her voice as soft as the wind moving through the branches above them. I have scars too, Alessandro. Mine are just hidden under my skin. Something shifted inside Alessandro's chest, and it didn't shift back. He looked at this young woman, her sleeping daughter draped over his shoulder, the calm honesty of someone who had already survived her own war. And he understood, with a quiet kind of astonishment, that she was not going to leave. Sophia stayed. What grew between them after that autumn evening beneath the oak didn't grow the way things usually grow in stories. It bloomed like a winter rose. Slowly.
Stubbornly.
One petal opening at a time, in weather that was never quite kind enough to promise it would survive. Sophia started bringing coffee to his study near midnight. She told herself each night that she was just being useful, that she'd heard him still awake at his desk when she got up to check on Emma, that the pot was already warm, that one more cup wasn't extra work. She didn't tell herself, though she knew it was true, that she couldn't fall asleep until she saw his lamp go dark. Alessandro, for his part, began leaving that lamp on later than the ledgers required. He didn't speak much on those nights. He'd look up when she set the porcelain cup at his elbow, and something in his gray eyes would soften just a fraction. He'd say her name once. Low, the way a man says something he's still learning to hold. She'd nod and leave. That was all. He began reading to Emma at bedtime. The first time, Sophia stood frozen outside the playroom door, unable to believe what she was hearing. The voice on the other side was gentler than any voice she'd ever heard leave his mouth. He read a story about a small rabbit lost in a great forest, and he did the voices for every animal the rabbit met. Emma laughed until she hiccuped. He gave her the silver pocket watch to hold while he read. She pressed it against her ear and listened to it sing until her eyes drifted shut. Somewhere in the middle of the second week, she started calling it Uncle Alex's heart. Sophia understood, without needing anyone to explain it, what that meant. He had placed his father's watch into her daughter's hands. The great dining room, built for 20, was silently retired. Their meals moved to the small round table in the back kitchen, where Rosa served all three of them together at 7 o'clock and pretended not to watch. Alessandro learned how Emma liked her toast cut. Emma learned that if she said please twice, the boss of the house would give her the last piece of orange from his plate. One gray afternoon, a heavy rain trapped them all inside. Emma stood at the tall parlor window in her stocking feet, both palms pressed flat against the glass, watching raindrops race each other down the pane. She squealed with delight every time hers won. Behind her, Alessandro and Sophia stood side by side at the same window, close enough that their sleeves brushed. He looked down at her hand resting on the sill, and he covered it very gently with his own.
She did not pull away.
He turned toward her. She turned toward him. He leaned down until she could feel the warmth of his breath against her cheek. Her heart forgot how to beat evenly for one long, suspended second. The door of the parlor slammed open without a knock. Don Alessandro Marco Biani's voice cut through the room like a blade. East Harbor. A shipment came in tonight. 3 of our men are dead. Whoever hit them knew the exact hour and the exact pier. Alessandro's hand slid away from Sophia's. Marco was already turning back toward the corridor. Sophia let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Alessandro looked down at his empty hand. The traitor was inside this house. The turn of the story arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Down in the reinforced meeting room at the lower west corridor, Alessandro stood at the head of a long oak table, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a black marker in his hand. Around him sat Marco Bianchi and 3 of the family's most senior capos. On the wall behind him, pinned to a corkboard the width of 2 doorways, was a hand-drawn map of the last 4 months of leaks. Red pins for shipments lost. Black pins for men dead. Blue lines connecting each incident to the small handful of people who had known the details in advance. The pattern emerging on that board didn't need a name yet. It just needed a little more time. Alessandro traced a blue line with the tip of his marker. His voice was low, controlled, methodical. None of them saw the door at the far end of the corridor click quietly shut behind a curious 3-year-old girl and a stray tortoiseshell kitten. Emma had wandered out of her playroom 15 minutes earlier. The kitten had appeared at her window that morning, thin, small, yellow-eyed, and she had chased it all afternoon in her stocking feet, giggling under her breath, entirely convinced this was the most important game of her life. The kitten led her out a side door, down a graveled service path, past a row of ornamental hedges, and finally to the wide double doors of the old storage building at the far back of the compound. Staff were forbidden there after 6 in the evening. Emma didn't know that. Emma was 3. She slipped through a gap between the doors after the kitten and stopped just inside. The storage building was enormous. Rows and rows of wooden crates stamped with words in Old Italian. Rows and stacks above her head. Sunlight fell through high, dusty windows and slanted golden beams. The kitten disappeared behind a pallet of wine barrels. Emma padded after it, humming softly. And then she heard a voice. She froze. She knew that voice. It was Uncle Carlo's voice. The polite old man who bowed to her mother every morning, who had once handed her a candy at Christmas. Except this voice didn't sound like the Uncle Carlo she knew. This voice was low and quick, full of a kind of anger that made Emma's small stomach twist without her understanding why. She crouched behind the wine barrels. Carlo Ricci was pacing in the narrow aisle between 2 stacks of crates, a phone pressed hard to his ear. He was speaking in another language, fast, hissing, a language Emma had never heard before. Most of the words meant nothing to her. Then, in the middle of the flood of foreign syllables, a few English words fell out. The boss's house almost mine soon. Emma held her breath. I'll open the gate. Bring everyone. The last 4 words were spoken with a strange, dark joy that made the little hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The kitten, restless behind her, brushed against a small wooden crate.
It tipped. It fell.
It clattered against the stone floor. Carlo whipped around. For one endless second, Emma saw his face clearly. And it was not the face of the polite old man who bowed to her mother. It was something else. Something she did not have words for. Something that made her afraid. She turned and ran on silent bare feet through the back door of the storage building, straight across the graveled path and out into the safety of the sunlit garden. Her small heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Alessandro had left the meeting room 10 minutes earlier with a dull, splitting ache behind his eyes. 3 hours in front of that corkboard had produced patterns, but no name. Every arrow he traced led back to the same small circle of 4 men. And he could not, for the life of him, force himself to write a 5th arrow across the paper toward the one man in that circle he had known since he was 14 years old. He walked out into the back garden and stood for a while beneath the ancient oak, one hand pressed flat against its rough bark, trying to breathe out something he could not name. Small bare feet came running across the grass behind him. Uncle Alex. Alex.
He turned.
Emma was hurrying toward him in her stocking feet, cheeks flushed pink, curls bouncing. One small fist pressed against her chest, like she was holding something in place. Alejandro's face softened, without permission. He crouched down and opened his arms, and she climbed straight onto his lap the way she had climbed onto his chest that first afternoon, as if this were the safest place in the world she knew. She looked up at him with honey-colored eyes. Uncle Alex. Uncle Carlo said, he's almost going to take your house soon. The world tilted. Alejandro did not move. He did not breathe. He kept his face very carefully still, because a change in his eyes right now might frighten her, and he needed more than he had ever needed anything for her not to be frightened. Sweetheart. His voice came out gentle and unhurried, though every muscle in his body had gone iron. Where did you hear that? She told him. She told him about the tortoiseshell kitten and the tall doors of the storage building. She told him about the wine barrels she had hidden behind. She told him about Uncle Carlo's voice, which had not sounded like Uncle Carlo's voice at all. Most of it, she said, had been words she did not know, but some of it had been English. She had understood some of it. He said, "Open the gate," she whispered, remembering carefully. And he said, "Bring everyone." She did not know what those words meant. She only remembered them because his voice had sounded so strange when he said them, and it had made her stomach feel funny, and she had run. There are moments in a man's life when the greatest secrets in his kingdom fall not from the mouths of his lieutenants or his enemies, but from the mouths of the smallest citizens in it. Alejandro Moretti heard the entire architecture of his own destruction from the lips of a 3-year-old girl sitting on his knee beneath his father's tree, and outwardly, he did not so much as blink. He lifted her chin gently with one finger. "You did very, very well, sweetheart. You are the bravest little girl in this whole house." Emma glowed. "But I need you to do one more brave thing for me. This is our secret. Yours and mine. Do not tell anyone what you heard. Not Rosa. Not the guards. Not even Mama. Just Uncle Alex."
Can you do that?
She nodded solemnly. All 3 years of her. Utterly serious. "Cross my heart, Uncle." He kissed her forehead. He set her back down on the grass and watched her scamper off toward the fountain. Then he walked back into the house, up the stairs, and into his study. He picked up the internal phone. "Marco."
Come here.
"Only you." When Marco arrived and closed the door behind him, Alejandro said only 3 words. "It is Carlo." Marco Bianchi's face went the color of old paper. The investigation that followed was so quiet that no one else in the compound so much as sensed it moving beneath their feet. Only 2 men in the world knew it existed. Alessandro and Marco spoke of it in one room only, the small, windowless office behind the wine cellar that had no telephone line, no vent that carried voices, and no key that had ever been given to Carlo Ricci. They met there at odd hours. They kept no written notes. Every word was carried out of that room in their heads, and nowhere else. Marco brought in a technician he had known since the war with the Costa family, a silent, gray-haired man who owed his life twice over to Marco Bianchi and had never once mentioned either debt. Within 48 hours, Carlo's private cellular phone was tapped. His study line was tapped, and a small magnetic tracker, no larger than a coin, had been fixed to the underside of the fuel tank on his personal black Mercedes. Marco himself began following the old butler after dark. He drove 3 cars in rotation. None of them registered to the family. He wore a dark coat and a driver's cap. He kept his headlights off on the last stretch of every approach. Within 1 week, every doubt Alessandro had ever whispered to himself in the study collapsed into a truth so cold it could have been carved out of stone. Carlo Ricci had been meeting the men of Don Vittorio Sabatini for years. Not months. Years. Deserted seaside restaurants where the owners never asked names. Small, tucked-away hotels along the northern coast where the same second-floor room was always reserved under a different letter of the alphabet. In each meeting, envelopes changed hands. In each meeting, information moved out of the Moretti house and into the pocket of a rival empire. Shipment schedules, truck routes, the addresses of the small, quiet homes where the capos hid their wives and their children. Every wound the family had bled from in the last 12 months had walked out of the compound in Carlo's briefcase. And then Marco brought Alessandro the piece of information that changed the temperature of the room. Naples. 5 years ago.
De trattoria.
The 3 men who had come through the kitchen door. It had not been Elena Vesquez alone. The reservation number had been leaked to Sabatini through Carlo Ricci first. Elena had merely been the messenger, the beautiful hand that carried the paper. Carlo had chosen her. Carlo had cultivated her. Carlo had, in the end, sold his own daughter to the men who had put a bullet an inch and a half below the artery in his neck. Alessandro received this piece of news standing beside the fireplace in the small office. He did not shout. He did not curse. His fury, when it arrived, did not arrive as fire. It arrived as ice, thick and quiet, the kind of ice that forms slowly at the bottom of a deep, unmoving lake. "What is he planning now?" he asked very softly. "To open the north service gate at 3 a.m. on a night of his choosing," Marco said. "Sabatini will send 30 men. The plan is to take the entire family in a single night." Alejandro did not confront Carlo. Not yet. He began instead to plan. He also began silently to build a wall around his east wing. 4 of his most trusted riflemen were quietly reassigned to Sofia and Emma. Each was dressed as a gardener. Each carried a pistol under his overalls. Each had been given one instruction and one only. If anything at all, happened to that mother and that child, They were to die trying to stop it before they permitted a single hair on either head to be harmed. Carlo, meanwhile, was beginning to feel the walls of the compound close very slowly around him.
4 in the morning on a Tuesday.
Carlo Ricci sat on the edge of his bed in the small suite he had occupied for 15 years and did not turn on the lamp. The night before, while changing the oil filter of his Mercedes in the private garage, he had run his fingers along the underside of the fuel tank, the way any careful man runs his fingers along the underside of a fuel tank, and his fingertips had touched a small, round shape that did not belong there. He had left it exactly where it was. He had also, 2 evenings ago, noticed a soft click on his cellular line just before a call to his sister connected. He had said nothing. He had made his voice bright. He had asked her about the weather in the north. He was old. He was 55. He had served the Moretti family for a decade and a half. And he knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent his life reading the small tales of powerful men, that Don Alessandro Moretti had begun to move against him. His time was over. He rose in silence. He did not pack much. A worn leather briefcase filled with the papers he had built up in secret for 6 years. Ledgers of shipments. Names.
Routes.
The coded contact list for every member of the Sabatini organization. A small canvas bag with more cash in it than most of the guards in the compound would earn in 3 lifetimes. A personal Beretta, oiled 2 nights ago, tucked into the small of his back. He walked out through the North Service Gate, the one whose key had rested only on his own ring for 11 years. He drove east, then north, out into the dark countryside beyond the city. Halfway there, on a stretch of empty road, he saw a pair of headlights appear in his rearview mirror. The road stretched empty between 2 sleeping villages, dark and still under a sky that had not yet decided to wake. He made 1 telephone call. Not to Don Vittorio Sabatini. That call could wait. This one was more urgent. He called 2 men he had never met face to face. He had only spoken to them twice before on burner phones. Professionals. Sabatini had put them on retainer 3 weeks earlier, at Carlos' own recommendation. For exactly this contingency. Kidnappers who had done 6 clean jobs across the North Coast in the last 4 years. Take the woman and the child, Carlos said quietly into the phone. His voice was almost peaceful. Bring them somewhere he cannot reach quickly. Force him out of his fortress. He hung up. He drove on. Behind him, back inside the walls he had just betrayed for the last time, dawn was arriving with terrible speed. Marco Bianca was in the guardhouse at 6:12 when the roll of the night shift came back 1 man short. 15 minutes of searching later, he burst into Alejandro's study with the collar of his coat half open and his face gray as steel. Alejandro had not yet finished his first cup of coffee. Carlo is gone. His car is gone. The north gate was opened from the inside. Alejandro set the cup down. He rose to his feet. He was already moving toward the east wing before Marco reached the next sentence. Marco followed at a run. Boss, there is more. The east wing door is open. Alejandro's stride broke into something faster. Sophia and Emma are gone. 3 of the 4 gardener detail are dead in the corridor. The 4th is critical. They reached the east wing. The door of the playroom was open. The little cream rug had been kicked half aside. A wooden block lay overturned in the doorway. On the small round table where Emma took her breakfast every morning, weighted down by the silver salt shaker, sat a folded sheet of white paper. Alejandro lifted the note from beneath the salt shaker with 2 fingers, as if the paper itself might burn him. The handwriting was blocky and impersonal. Block capitals, black ink, printed by a man who did not want a signature. Asterisk, Warehouse 47, Industrial Docks. Come alone, unarmed, before sunset. If you fail, the woman first, then the child. Asterisk. He read it once. He did not read it twice. He folded it into the inner pocket of his coat next to the silver watch and walked out of the east wing without a word. Marco fell in behind him. By the time they reached the war room in the lower west corridor, the radios along the far wall were already alive. Casino Aurora bomb, front entrance. Multiple casualties. Casino Il Trionfo, second explosion. Service alley. Pier Warehouse 3. Pier Warehouse 5.
Fire.
Fire spreading north perimeter. 30 armed men in position along the tree line. No shots yet. Marco crossed the room in 2 strides and hit the master switch. He turned toward Alejandro with the map of the city on the wall behind him. 100 colored pins already lit up along its coastline like a burning necklace. Don Alejandro, this is a perfect trap. His voice was low, tight, absolute. They are burning your empire tonight to force one thing. And that one thing is you. They want you out of the compound so they can put a bullet in your chest. If you go to that warehouse, you will die. If you die, this family dies with you before sunrise. I am telling you this as the man who has stood at your left shoulder for 12 years. And I am telling you, it is the truth. Alejandro did not answer him. His gray eyes had already gone to the small framed photograph on the corner of the war table. The one he had taken with his own phone and printed out 3 weeks earlier. Emma, sitting cross-legged on the parlor rug in her pink dress, laughing up at the camera with the silver pocket watch dangling from her tiny fist. Sophia had given her the watch that very morning to hold for the day. Alejandro remembered her small hand curled around it now, wherever she was. He looked up. He did not answer Marco with words. He turned toward the great steel weapons cabinet along the back wall. He unlocked it. He drew out 2 Beretta pistols, checked each magazine, slid them into shoulder holsters beneath his coat. He drew out a small submachine gun with a folding stock and slung it across his back beneath his jacket. He pocketed 3 spare magazines. He turned around. Marco. Yes, Don Alejandro. Pick 10. The best 10 in this house. Men who will follow me into that warehouse and not ask a question until we are all out or all dead. We will not go alone, but we will go. Understood. The rest hold this compound, at any cost. If Sabatini's line breaks through the north wall, the family gathers in the lower bunker until dawn. If I do not come back tonight, this family is yours. You are the boss until the capos vote a new one. And I will write that down on paper before I walk out that door. Send your wife and your son out of the city on the 8 o'clock train. Tonight, Marco Bianca, who had knelt to no man since he had been made a capo in this house 9 years ago, went down onto one knee on the stone floor of the war room. There is no need to send my family anywhere, Don Alejandro, because you are coming back. Alejandro reached down and closed his hand once around Marco's shoulder. He walked out of the war room at sunset, and the great gates of the compound opened before him. Warehouse 47 rose out of the old dock district like a gray tombstone. It was an enormous slab of unpainted concrete, 4 stories high. Its corrugated tin roof rusted the color of dried blood. Its high, narrow windows were either broken out or boarded over. The dock behind it had not received a legitimate shipment in 11 years. The only movement in the surrounding lot came from stray dogs and the wind lifting torn plastic sheeting off empty pallets. Alejandro approached from 3 directions. The 10 men Marco had chosen were the 10 best in the family. 2 of them carried short shotguns for close quarters. 2 carried scoped rifles and disappeared into the wrecked hulks of neighboring buildings to command the roof lines. 6 followed Alejandro on foot in 2 flanking columns, moving like water through the dark. The plan Sabatini had drawn up on the other side of these walls had counted on 1 man walking through the front door alone and unarmed. What was crossing that lot now was less than an army, but far, far more than 1 man. The moment the great front doors of the warehouse rolled open, the guns opened. Glass burst from the high windows. Muzzle flashes lit the concrete cavern in strobing white. The air filled with the sharp mineral smell of gunpowder and the acid ring of empty casings striking stone. Alejandro's team went in low along the 2 side walls, clearing crate stacks in disciplined pairs, moving forward 1 row at a time. Alejandro walked straight up the center aisle with a submachine gun held level at his shoulder. 15 of Sabatini's men had been posted in the main hall. 10 minutes later, 13 of them were on the floor, and the last 2 lay bleeding behind an overturned steel drum, calling for a mother neither of them would see again. Alejandro did not slow down. At the far end of the main hall, a heavy steel door led into what had once been the foreman's office. He heard from the other side the small, unmistakable sound of a child crying. He kicked it in. The door slammed back on its hinges, and Alejandro Moretti walked into a small square room lit by a single bare bulb. Sofia was tied to a wooden chair in the center of the concrete floor. Her wrists bound behind her, a strip of coarse fabric knotted between her teeth. Her cheek was swollen. Her dress was torn along one shoulder. Her eyes, when they found him, filled instantly with tears. Emma sat on her mother's lap, her small legs curled up beneath her, her face pressed against Sofia's collarbone. In both of her tiny hands, clutched so tightly her knuckles had gone white, she held the silver pocket watch. The ticking was still going. Alejandro could hear it. Behind them, one gloved hand resting on the back of Sofia's chair, and the other holding a beretta pressed lightly against her temple, stood Carlo. Richie was smiling. It wasn't the kind of smile that belonged on the face of a polite old butler who had once brought coffee to a widow's son on the morning after a funeral, 12 years ago. That version of Richie had been erased. This was a lopsided, terrible smile. The smile of a man who had waited 15 years for a single moment and had finally stepped inside it. "Don Alessandro," he said, his voice almost warm. "Your father took my family's name from us in the winter of 1986. I am only returning what is owed." Alessandro raised his weapon. Carlo raised his behind him. But Alessandro didn't notice the narrow service door at the back of the hallway, easing silently open. The two men faced each other across the small concrete room in a silence that felt older than either of them. Both knew exactly what this geometry of violence demanded. Whoever pulled his trigger a heartbeat sooner would live just long enough to see the other fall. And then, in the very next heartbeat, that man would almost certainly die too. Alessandro's rifle was already leveled at Carlo's chest. Carlo's pistol was pressed against the skin of Sofia's temple. Neither man lowered so much as an eyelid. Behind Alessandro, unheard by anyone still standing in the room, the small service door swung fully open. Renzo Colombo stepped through without a sound. He was 26 years old, thin as wire, and the finest young marksman the Sabatini organization had ever recruited. He had been positioned in the neighboring building for the last 4 hours, waiting for exactly this window. He raised his long-barreled pistol and sighted along it. The small black hole at the end stared straight at the center of Alessandro Moretti's back. Sofia saw him. Her arms were tied behind the wooden chair. Her mouth was gagged. She couldn't scream. She couldn't point. She couldn't even lift a hand to warn him. She had one option left. She threw the whole weight of her body forward with everything she had, chair and all, and hurled herself sideways into the space between the shooter and the man she loved. The gun went off. The bullet that had been meant for Alessandro's heart struck Sofia through the top of her left shoulder and passed clean through the back of the wooden chair. She toppled sideways with the chair beneath her and struck the concrete floor with a sound Alessandro would hear in his dreams for the rest of his life. Blood spread in a fast, dark bloom across the front of her pale gray uniform. Emma screamed. It was a small scream, and yet it was the loudest sound Alessandro Moretti had ever heard in 38 years of a life full of loud sounds. It was the sound of a 3-year-old watching her mother fall. Alessandro turned toward the back hallway. He turned slowly. There are moments in a man's life when the truest measure of his strength is not in the fists he raises, but in what he chooses, in that instant, to protect. The measure of him now was written in the ice that settled behind his gray eyes. He fired one round. Renzo Colombo dropped where he stood. The third eye appeared between the first two before his brain had even understood he'd been seen. Alessandro turned back toward Carlo. Carlo Richie fell to his knees on the concrete. His beretta clattered from his fingers and skidded across the floor. "Alessandro, please. 15 years. 15 years, I served this house. I begged your father once. Only once. And he..." Alessandro fired without a word. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees beside the fallen chair. He cut the ropes from Sofia's wrists with a small knife from his boot. He lifted her against his chest as gently as if she were still made of glass. Emma, released, threw herself against him and buried her small face in his coat. The silver pocket watch had rolled from her fist and lay ticking quietly on the blood-stained concrete beside them. Marco Bianchi burst through the shattered doorway with two men at his shoulder, weapons raised. Alessandro did not look up. His voice, when it came, was cracked in half. Get her out. The final battle for the city outside would go on without him. Alessandro carried Sofia out of that concrete room in his own arms. He didn't let anyone else touch her. He walked past the two men Marco had brought with him, past the bodies in the main hall, past the shattered doors of Warehouse 47, and out into the salt-heavy air of the docks. Emma clung to his neck with both small arms, her curly head tucked hard against his cheek, her tears soaking into the collar of his coat. The silver pocket watch was clenched inside her fist. It was still ticking. Somewhere along the way through the main hall, Alessandro had reached down and closed her fingers around it again, without stopping to look behind him. Marco Bianchi lifted the small black radio at his belt and began, without ceremony, to end the war. The 7 surviving members of the elite team finished clearing the warehouse room by room. Back at the estate, the siege along the north wall broke at 11 that night. The 30 Sabatini gunmen at the tree line had been outflanked by riflemen coming down through the ridge behind them. Half surrendered. Half did not. Half of that half survived until dawn. Before the sun came up, Marco led 20 of his own men in a direct assault on Don Vittorio Sabatini's estate on the northern coast. It was not a raid. It was a storm arriving with a plan. Every gate had been mapped. Every exit had been sealed. Every bodyguard was neutralized before he could reach a phone. Don Vittorio Sabatini was shot in his own bedroom just before 4 in the morning, a glass of red wine still balanced in his hand. By breakfast, the Sabatini organization had ceased to exist. The remaining capos knelt on marble floors and asked to be absorbed under the Moretti banner. The territory that had been carved into 2 empires for 11 years belonged, once again, to one man alone. But Alessandro Moretti was not there to hear the news of his victory. He was in a small private hospital room on the 3rd floor of a clinic Marco had used before. He sat in a stiff plastic chair beside a narrow white bed, and he did not leave it for 3 days. He did not sleep. He did not shave. He did not eat more than a piece of bread Marco pressed into his hand at some point on the 2nd afternoon. The nurses learned to walk around him. The doctors learned to speak past him. He kept one hand curled around Sofia's fingers where they rested on top of the thin blanket, and he did not let go. Emma slept beside her mother in the same narrow bed, curled against Sofia's uninjured side, her small palms still pressed around the silver pocket watch, its casing smooth. There was a tiny, fresh scratch now. The bullet in the warehouse had struck the edge of the watch before ricocheting up into Sofia's shoulder. 2 more millimeters, and Emma would have lost her mother. 2 more millimeters, and Alessandro would have lost everything. On the morning of the 4th day, Sofia opened her eyes. The first thing they searched for was him. He rose and came to her side. He did not kneel. He did not propose. Not here. Not in this pale white room that still smelled of iodine. Not while she was too weak to sit up. He simply lifted her cool hand and pressed it against his rough, unshaven cheek. And closed his eyes. I am not losing you again, he whispered. Sofia smiled faintly. I know. Months passed. The ancient oak in the back garden waited. Spring arrived the following May. Sofia had healed. On the top of her left shoulder, there remained a small round scar, the size of a coin, pale against her skin. Every morning, when the first light came through the tall bedroom window of the estate, Alessandro would lean over and press his lips to that scar, as gently as a man asking forgiveness for a debt he could never quite repay. Sofia would smile into his hair. It had become their quiet ceremony. The mansion no longer felt like the same house. A young woman's laugh now echoed through its halls. Laughter now echoed through the marble halls. Every morning at 7 o'clock, the soft patter of small bare feet crossed the polished wooden floors of the East Wing. The grand dining room, built to seat 20, had been closed off completely. Instead, the family took every meal at a little round table tucked away in the back kitchen. Rosa, the head cook, had gained 10 pounds, and for the first time in 6 years, she couldn't stop smiling. Marco Bianchi, Now the acknowledged second-in-command of the family had started bringing his own wife and son for Sunday lunch. And out at the far edge of the garden, the ancient oak no longer waited for a lonely man to lie beneath it, pretending to sleep. It waited for a family. On a golden afternoon in early May, Alessandro led Sofia and Emma across the lawn toward the great tree. He carried a folded blue velvet blanket under one arm. Carefully, he spread it out in the soft pool of shade beneath the branches, exactly where a little girl in a pink dress had once climbed onto the chest of a man who believed he had no heart left to reach. Emma sat cross-legged on the blanket in her new yellow sundress, singing softly to the silver pocket watch cradled in both palms. It had become her most treasured possession. The small scratch along its casing had never been polished out. Alessandro sat down beside her and held out his open hand. Without being asked, Emma placed the watch into his palm. He clicked it open. The gentle, familiar ticking rose into the warm air. And then he did something even Marco Bienzi had never seen him do. He slid one thumbnail beneath the inner face of the mechanism and eased open a hidden compartment, no larger than a fingernail, tucked beneath the small brass gears. Inside lay a small gold ring, old, delicately engraved, warmed by the years it had waited in the dark. It had belonged to Isabella Moretti, Alessandro's mother. His father, Salvatore, had entrusted it to him 3 weeks before his heart gave out, with only one instruction: keep it hidden until someday a woman worthy of it walked into his son's life. Alessandro lowered himself onto one knee in the grass. Emma gasped and clapped both small hands over her mouth in absolute delight. Uncle Alex is asking Mama for her permission. Sophia's eyes filled instantly. But her tears this time were not the tears of a young mother running from a rainy city with $300 in her wallet. They were the tears of a woman who had, at last, after 27 years of running, arrived home. She said yes. She said it laughing and crying at the same time. Alessandro slid the ring onto her finger and pulled her gently down onto the blanket, into his arms. Emma threw herself onto both of them and buried her face against her mother's neck. And the three of them sat together beneath the great tree that had watched over the Moretti family for 3 generations, under a spring sky as clean and blue as the beginning of a life. Alessandro Moretti no longer pretended to sleep beneath the oak. He had come home. Sometimes, the most powerful man in a city is not the one who commands armies, but the one who finally lets a small hand rest over his heart and does not push it away. And so, dear friends, this is where the story of the boss under the oak comes gently to its close. If there is one truth this journey has tried to place softly into your palms, it is this: the real strength of a person is not measured by the walls they build around themselves, nor by the fists they raise against the world. It is measured by what they choose, in the end, to protect. Empires can be won and lost in a single night, but a small hand resting over a lonely heart can rewrite an entire life. And now, the story would love to hear from you. Has there ever been a moment in your own life when a small, quiet person, perhaps a child, perhaps a stranger, perhaps someone the world would call unimportant, walked into your days and changed the way you saw yourself forever? A grandchild who softened your grief. A niece who made you laugh again. A neighbor's little one who saw you when no one else did. Whoever they are, we would love to hear their story. Please share it with us in the comments below and tell us which country you are watching from tonight. Every voice you leave here is read, and every one of them matters. If this story touched something inside you, even for a moment, please take one small breath to press the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who might need to hear it today. Your support is what allows stories like this to keep finding their way into the world, one quiet evening at a time. From all of us here, we wish you good health, deep peace, and many warm, simple moments of love in the days and nights ahead. May your own oak tree be waiting for you somewhere. May the small hand you have been longing for find its way to your chest. Take care of yourself, and take care of the people who lie down beneath your branches.